Welcome to Witch Hunt. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
And I'm Sarah Jack. Today we continue our exploration of witch representation on stage and screen.
There's no bigger witch story in modern entertainment than Wicked. As we anticipate the upcoming film adaptation, we're thrilled to welcome two distinguished scholars who bring unique perspectives to this revolutionary musical.
Paul Laird, professor emeritus of musicology at the University of Kansas, wrote the definitive book on Wicked's development and had unprecedented access to composer Stephen Schwartz during the show's creation.
And Jane Barnette, professor of theater and dance at the University of Kansas and author of Witch Fulfillment, brings her expertise in adaptation and witch representation, offering insights into how Wicked transformed our understanding of witch characters on stage.
Together, they'll help us understand how this reimagining of Oz's witches continues to challenge our assumptions about good, evil, and the power of female friendship.
From its groundbreaking music to its political resonance, from its original Broadway run to its upcoming film adaptation, we'll explore why Wicked's magic endures.
So whether you're a dedicated fan who knows every word of Defying Gravity, or you're just curious about how stories about witches reflect our changing culture, this conversation will give you new perspectives on this remarkable show.
Let's dive in.
Welcome to Witch Hunt Podcasts. Thank you both for joining us. Before we explore Wicked, would you tell our listeners about your work in this realm and what drew you to studying this remarkable piece?
Well, my name is Paul Laird. I'm a professor emeritus of musicology at the University of Kansas. For a number of years, I've specialized in research in musical theater. It's taken me into various corners. The corner of interest here is I've worked extensively on the music and works of Stephen Schwartz. I wrote two books about it. One of them was on Wicked, and the other was on Schwartz's other works with a tiny little chapter on Wicked, referring them to the larger study. I've interviewed Stephen Schwartz a number of times, and I've done a great deal of other publishing on other aspects of musical theater.
And yes, my name's Jane Barnette, and I'm a professor of theater and dance at the University of Kansas. My area of expertise is adaptation dramaturgy, and I have recently written a book called Witch Fulfillment, which is about the wishes we fulfill when we put witch characters on stage. And a couple of those chapters specifically reference Wicked. So because it's an adaptation and also because it features witch characters, it is definitely something of interest to my research. And in addition, a future project of mine is also tackling the question of revisal, not revival, but revisal in musical theater, especially as it connects to the work of dramaturgical research.
And Professor Laird, could you tell us more about your books, Wicked, a Musical Biography, and the musical theater of Stephen Schwartz?
Certainly. There was originally going to be just one book on the musicals of Stephen Schwartz, but as I started working on it, I was given just reams of material on the writing of Wicked. So it turned into a single book. It was called Wicked, a Musical Biography. It came out in 2011 from Rowman and Littlefield. And 3 years later, I published a book on the musical theater of Stephen Schwartz. These were based upon extensive interviews with Schwartz and people that he worked with, various collaborators. In reference to Wicked, I also spoke to Whitney Holtzman, the woman who wrote the book of Wicked. I spoke to Stephen Aramus, who was the music supervisor. I spoke to William David Brown, who was the orchestrator, along with a few other people. So I had access to a lot of primary materials, including I saw many scripts as they were preparing the show, a lot of drafts of songs, and I even had an orchestral score from the recording, which is, when you do what I do, that's the holy grail of musicology study, musical theater, because you almost never see orchestrations. So they made a great deal of material available to me, and I was able to write in quite a bit of detail on Wicked, especially, but I know all of his output quite well.
Thank you. And Professor Barnette, can you tell us more about Witch Fulfillment?
Sure. This book was in some ways a follow-up to my first book, which is called Adapturgy, a new word that I decided should be in the lexicon. That is basically a sort of condensation of adaptation dramaturgy. And I, for a long time, have been fascinated with the ways that we frame witchcraft on stage and the sort of differences between a fantasy witch and some depictions of witchcraft that we might see in real life. And also, just for what it's worth, I, like so many other people, had been obsessed with the Wizard of Oz for so long. And when I have taught adaptation dramaturgy, well before I wrote the book Adapturgy, I used to use the Wizard of Oz as a case study because it's such a familiar story to use to think through different kinds of adaptations in different media. But I have to say, Paul, so much of your work was so helpful in the chapters where I talk about Wicked because, as you say, you had that incredible access that helped us to kind of build the pre-story to how we get to where what most people sort of think of as the beginning of Wicked on Broadway stage. Paul is able to really bring us into the pre-story, which, of course, for anybody interested in adaptation, is a crucial piece of the puzzle. But witch fulfillment is written as a ritual, so it's basically written in the order in which contemporary witches might call circle. And so it starts, at least in my tradition, in the East, which has the element of air, and that is the chapter that I discuss Wicked and other Wizard of Oz adaptations.
We're going to jump in. Baum's introduction of good witches marked a cultural shift in American understanding of witchcraft. How does Wicked further complicate the good-bad witch dichotomy established by the Wizard of Oz?
So I'm glad that you mentioned that because I think that's an important piece of the puzzle to understand how there wasn't room really for thinking about or having iconic representation of a so-called good witch before Baum in the American culture especially. But what we see with Wicked that's so intriguing, starting with Maguire and then, of course, on the musical stage and now coming on the film, is the question of how did the Wicked Witch get to be wicked? And what does it mean to be wicked? And is it actually wicked if what the person is doing is rooted in a desire for social justice? And so depending on one's read and depending on one's reception of both the novel and the musical, and again, coming soon to theaters near you, the film, part of what it complicates is this overall question of, is she so wicked after all? Can we see why she does the things she does? And more frankly, maybe to the point, is Glinda so great in the first place? I think we do get some redemption, at least in the musical version of Glinda or Galinda. But at the beginning, when we meet her, at least for me, as someone who was an outcast of my own, I was not at all. I was like, ooh, who is this pink frothy thing? So yeah, it complicates it a great deal.
Yeah, and in fact, in putting together Wicked, one of the core ideas of the entire show was dealing with good versus wicked, questioning which is which. And Schwartz was, at first, every song was going to include either the word good or the word wicked in the title. He realized this was a very bad idea. It was far limiting what he was trying to do, but that's how far he was taking the idea. And the political aspects which are very strong in the stage version, and it's going to be fascinating to see how that transfers into the film, especially now. But the political aspects of it are, they're sort of what make, is Glinda good? Well, not really. And of course, it was Gregory Maguire's idea to turn the entire story on its head and have this wicked witch actually be this person campaigning for social justice. And the story itself, the musical itself, is far more complicated than most of the fans of the show are ever going to want to admit.
It's true.
Thank you. How would you answer the question, why these witches now?
I'll start with that one just because that's what I like to call the dramaturgical question, and I'm not the only one. Most dramaturgs do call it that. It's the question we always ask ourselves when we're putting on a theatrical production, but of course it can be transferred to any media. And it's that notion of, okay, fine, you want to stage a show, but why? What does it say to your audiences? So not only time-wise, but also location-wise. Who are your audiences? And one of the things to keep in mind, of course, is that Broadway audiences for a long, long time have been predominantly female. And yet, many musicals had missed an opportunity to truly focus on female friendship and on the centering of female agency. Not to suggest that there were none that did that, but as Paul points out with much more acumen in terms of the musicality, there's a difference here in terms of the depth of characterization that is allowed to occur for both Elphaba and Glinda. And I think why this musical now for then was certainly, in terms of when Wicked the Musical began on Broadway and even before that in development, I think that was in response to shifts that were happening, I'm sure globally, but certainly in the United States, in terms of thinking about a new kind of era and thinking through the sort of shift to a different way of perhaps how we might think of what it means to be an American. And then, of course, now, and even more so at this exact moment after the election, but certainly leading up to the election and after, in my opinion, after the decision that the Supreme Court made with Dobbs, I mean, I think there's just been a real awakening, regardless of political persuasion, an awakening among folks who have uteruses about the importance of really having that agency to say what is on one's mind, but also to make decisions about one's body.
Why these witches now? You know, in a way, I'm not trying to argue the other side here, but Oz is timeless.
Yes, that's true.
Oz is by far and away the most important American literary fantasy. It has changed more people's lives than almost any American story I can think of. Schwartz, he didn't even read the book by Gregory Maguire. He was on a scuba diving trip in Hawaii, and somebody mentioned this book they were reading, Gregory Maguire, and gave him a few sentences about it. And he says, when I hear a good idea for a musical, a bell goes off in my head, and it went off immediately. I mean, he didn't even have the book in his hand, and he called up his agent and said, find out who has the rights to this. We need this. He knew a good story, a good idea when he heard one, again, without having any access to the book yet. So I do think there's a strong timeless nature here. That said, again, a lot of it I think has to do with the politics in the show. The song Popular actually has the word great communicator in it, making fun of the great communicator. And of course, people my age who lived through the Reagan era, this is what people called him for whatever reason. And it was a very pointed reference. Of course, it wasn't a reference for 2003. It was a reference going back to the 1980s, but there were a lot of people who remembered it. I just think what this show has to say about politics in the United States in the last 40 years is really quite extraordinary. For the moment, as Jane has already said, it couldn't be more timely. But I do also think that the idea of two women in a show, two powerful women in a show that it is one of the strongest calls for female empowerment Broadway has ever seen. It's just fascinating that one is a, quote, good witch, and one is, quote, sorry for the scarecrows, but bad witch. And then we spend the whole show wrestling on which is which.
Yeah, if I can follow up really quickly, I certainly agree that the timelessness of The Wizard of Oz is, at least from my perspective, unquestionable. And it's truly not a surprise, may I say, that Schwartz had not read the novel when, again, with all due respect, certainly what he ended up creating was quite incredible, extraordinary. But as you also point out too, Paul, in terms of the development piece, once we get the actual singers in the room, especially Idina Menzel, but even Chenoweth, right? That starts to shape the musical, the quality of the musical itself. And so there are a lot of us, myself included, who are a little disappointed that he missed some of the darker sides of Maguire's novel and the sort of arguably powerful queer undertones that are in Maguire's novel. Now, there are others who have read Wicked, of course, as you well know, Paul. For example, Stacey Wolf has a very compelling argument about the queer love story between Elphaba and Glinda. And I think that's compelling, right? But one of the things that is true of every musical, but I think in some ways, especially this one, because of its fan culture, is that there's the intention of the writers and what they may have started with, but then there's the fan response. And at this point, arguably, the fan response has wholly and utterly taken over whatever it was that they might have started with.
Oh,
Yeah.
20 years on, yeah, the fan
Yeah.
response is probably as important or more important than the original intentions. But yeah, I mean, I talked to both Holzman and Schwartz about, well, you didn't really take the story that's there. And they both said, well, yes, once you get the rights to the story, you can do whatever you want with it. And they took the characters and made our own story out of it. But I was completely shocked. The first time I saw the show, I was interviewing Schwartz right after it. I read the novel and I saw the show and I was like, what would I ask him? I mean, I felt at sea because it was so different. But then I also have to admit, as a musical theater scholar, I realized that if they'd set the exact story that was there, Elphaba would have sung 16 songs in a minor key and it would have closed on opening night.
Yes.
It's the adaptation here. It's a fascinating story and a little bit beyond what we're doing here, but it also has a lot to say about what the witches do and who they are.
Would you like to elaborate on that? How it affects who the witches are?
One of the things that I noticed, at least in terms of versus the novel versus the musical on stage, has to do with that origin story of why is her skin green? Who is Elphaba? And I do want to acknowledge that this is one of those ongoing debates in fandom, but I think it's important in today's culture to acknowledge also that there's potential in terms of the baby being understood or seen as potentially intersex or otherwise just genderless. They reference the baby as it. And of course, we know about the salesman with the green potion and all of that piece of the puzzle. But I think from a queer lens, which was in many ways a through line for witch fulfillment, was queer theory and thinking through the ways that queer time and queer utopia can help us understand witchcraft. I think that piece for me was one of the most regrettable missed opportunities. And there's like a moment, like I would say not even a second, but like potentially a half second of potential there with that sort of storyline of that salesman with the green potion that then is echoed in the musicality and even the staging later when we meet the wizard, of course, for good reasons, once we discover that sort of connection. But what wasn't there that I was really compelled by, and potentially, I don't know, might it be in the film, I hope, was the sort of question of how Elphaba performs gender or doesn't, right? Or how her performance goes up against it. It's implied because of the pinkness of Glinda. It's brand new words, right? Pinkness. It's implied, but it's not explored to the extent that I believe is certainly possible within Maguire's novel.
How does Stephen Schwartz score musically distinguish Glinda and Elphaba, and what does that tell us about how we're meant to understand each witch?
They have distinctive voices. They were conceived to have distinctive voices, but as Jane's already alluded to, the people they hired to sing the original roles made the score evolve in a slightly different direction for Glinda. Idina Menzel, the character of Elphaba was always going to be a belter, a rhythm and blues diva sort of role, which you get with The Wizard and I, and certainly in sections of Defying Gravity and other songs. But Idina Menzel brought to the role the ability to belt far higher on the treble staff than most singers consider advisable. Usually you're only belting to about the middle of the treble staff. She could do it all the way to the top. And it brings a keening quality to her songs that's not only attractive, it's just absolutely electrifying. But so when she came in fairly late in the process. They were workshopping this thing starting in 2000. Kristen Chenoweth actually came in I was either early 2001 or late 2000, but a couple of years before the show opened, she was involved. And so he was writing for her. Sorry, I got a little bit off. Let me finish with Idina Menzel. She came in much later, and a couple of the songs got rewritten with her in mind in subtle ways, but still, she was essentially the voice they were looking for. Glinda was also going to be a belter, and the songs like What Is This Feeling and Popular were written for a female belter, which is a very typical Broadway sound. Kristen Chenoweth, though, is singing she's kind of a freak because she belts really well and she also can sing very, very high above the treble staff. She has an absolutely operatic quality soprano extension in her voice, and she's a trained opera singer. And she kept saying to Schwartz, "Why can't I sing soprano?" And Schwartz kept telling her, "Because you can't be two people." And then he realized, wait a minute, she is two people. We have the private Glinda, the Glinda in the dorm, the Glinda talking to her friends. And we also have the public Glinda, Glinda the good, Glinda out speaking, Glinda out being Glinda the good. So those roles, those songs are written with the soprano extension. She goes not as high as she can, but pretty high in those songs. And then the private Glinda is the belter. They had to find women who can sing this role. As Schwartz said, you write it for one person, and then you find this whole pile of people out there who can do it. Obviously, it hasn't been a problem. The show's been running for over 20 years, minus COVID. But the types of singers they were played a major role in that, and it influenced what Schwartz was doing in his score. He would have been perfectly capable to write songs without even considering the singers. But when you're writing with a workshop process, which is the way most musicals are put together today, certainly all of his musicals are put together that way. You're dealing with actors, and sometimes the actors are so good in the role, which Kristen Chenoweth was, that they just keep singing the role. Stephanie Block was actually going to be Elphaba, but then Idina Menzel came in, auditioned, and replaced her. Stephanie Block played the role later.
Paul, can I add to what you're saying? And I want to be clear, a lot of this is coming from your work, but also Stacey Wolf I was thinking in terms of that, the vocal patterns that they establish, what I found to be really compelling, especially frankly in the audience, I read about it first and then I saw it in the audience, is the way that it switches. And that in For Good, right? Like that sort of moment in For Good where they switch is just, I did not expect to cry because I knew it was coming. But there is something about musical theater that is different from regular, quote unquote, straight theater, legit theater, however you want to make that distinction. But it truly is an embodied kind of spectatorship, right? Sometimes we tap our toes. Sometimes it's just sort of like a vibration in our body. But a lot of times it can make us laugh or cry. And in that moment For Good, where and Paul will
agree. Cross parts.
Thank you.
All of a sudden, Elphaba is singing above Glinda.
Yes.
And I know exactly the moment you're talking about, and it's incredibly satisfying.
Yes. It's electrifying. And you know what? It's witchcraft, if I may. That to me, as someone who studies witchcraft, was just so powerful because it's a transformation. So what's at the root of all witchcraft? Transformation. And to see that happen on stage through stagecraft, through music. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I get so excited.
No. Well, I mean, in some ways, such a skillfully written score is witchcraft. That's why you go through all of the workshops. If the song doesn't land, why didn't it land? Is it coming up to it? Is it leaving it? Is it something in the song itself? There's 20 songs on the original cast recording. Schwartz wrote parts of about 50 songs for this show. The amount of material I've seen of things that didn't end up in the show, including entirely written songs. There's a table in my book that goes on for pages about the various songs written for the song placements. It's, we're talking obviously about collaboration, but we're just talking about experimentation. What works the best? And in this score, make a bad pun, he scored because these songs were well tested. The performances were thought through by an awful lot of people. And so when you get a song like Defying Gravity or For Good, which, let's face it, high school kids are going to be singing it. High school females are going to be singing that song in final concerts until the end of time, because there is no better expression of the idea of best friends forever.
But I also think what you're talking about is dramaturgy, although it's not necessarily common parlance, right? Of course, collaboration has always been part of theater. Let me be clear. And I would also say so has dramaturgy. We haven't always necessarily acknowledged it. And one of the things that dramaturgy is strongest at is being that sort of extra set of eyes in the room or in the workshop who can say, oh, what I hear you doing is blah, blah, blah. I wonder would it make sense to switch registers at this point to see if that helps to solidify the way that they've kind of Because it's also, and I think, Paul, you point this out in your work as well, the fact that there's this talk about limitless versus limited, right? And there's this sort of switch that happens in terms of who thinks they're limited and who thinks they're limitless, right? So at first we see Elphaba thinking that she's limited, in large part because of her green skin, but also because she feels unloved and ostracized. And eventually she gets to a point of limitlessness, whereas Glinda comes in with this feeling of complete power that does get clipped because of the choices that she has made, arguably fairly selflessly, so that Elphaba can continue on in secret.
Yeah, choices that hurt her a great deal. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the growth in her character is quite extraordinary. She actually becomes a fully realized human being by the end of the second act. And of course, in the first act, she's just a silly young woman in many ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, the unlimited, of course, there's the unlimited motive that occurs in, I think it's stated 4 times during the course of the show. Schwartz knew early on that he wanted her to be singing unlimited. And then finally, Elphaba at the end is singing how she's limited because she can't go on. Her presence is not going to finish this. Glinda has to finish it. So yeah, the words limited and unlimited take on a very interesting take for both characters, both witches.
Mm-hmm.
There's also the third witch, of course, too, Madame Morrible.
Or the fourth, also Nessa Baum.
Yeah, Nessa Rose.
Oh, sorry, Nessa Rose.
Nessa Rose, yeah.
Why not Baum? Let's just forget that in.
Yeah, you've already got Elphaba named for his initials, so why not throw his whole name in there? How do you think the casting of Cynthia Erivo and Ariana Grande is going to impact the portrayals of these roles?
Now, this is a big thing, at least from my perspective, from Witch Fulfillment, the book that I mentioned earlier, because I have an early chapter about casting for the stage or for performance in general, but also casting in terms of spell casting and just how capacious the word is, because casting can mean fishing, it can mean a vote, God help us. It can mean a bunch of different things, right? But for a long time, American audiences have been clamoring to have a professional Black actress play the role of Elphaba, and there's been a lot of question about why, especially since she's going to be painted in green anyway. It just doesn't, it's been very odd. And also, frankly, in terms of the vocality, there are plenty of Black singers and musical theater actors who can play that role exquisitely.
Could I just interrupt very quickly?
Please, yeah.
Absolutely agree with what you're saying. We have to remember the model, the way that Idina Menzel is singing through most of that show comes more out of Black popular music than it does out of white popular music.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not to mention, and here, of course, don't let me get too far on the soapbox, but frankly, all of musical theater comes from that trajectory, right? Because there's this whole history of minstrelsy behind it, and not to mention parts of vaudeville and gospel music. Anyway, don't get me started on that. But I think that the casting of Cynthia in the role of Elphaba, that there is a great power in the representation, the opportunity to represent that particular role on film. It's not that Cynthia Erivo is not well known, because of course she is. She's Tony Award winning and certainly has had fame of her own. But I think this is a new frontier and something that a lot of the American fandom for Wicked has wanted for quite some time. I keep saying American because on the West End, they have had some examples of Black actors playing the role of Elphaba. Now, we have had a Black actor in the role of Glinda, Brittany Johnson. But there's another sort of layer of power in choosing Ariana Grande for that role. Is she playing against type? I don't know. I'm not that into Ariana Grande, but from my perspective as someone who started this whole quest to look at witch representation, my initial sort of pass at that book was about makeup design and also prosthetics from the neck up. So I've been for a long time very interested in how we use makeup to create freak or othered characters, things like the nose and headgear and stuff. And I personally am quite interested in the fact that Ariana Grande has a makeup company, REM, and that this is the person who ends up playing this role of Glinda. And why is that important? Well, because also the very first well-known Glinda, what is her name? Billy something?
Billy Burke.
That's
Billy
right,
Burke.
Billy Burke, had a sort of column about makeup in early magazines that sort of helped to guide in early cosmetic history. So there's this really interesting kind of, for the real nerds of makeup, right? There's this really interesting trajectory that can be traced with Ariana Grande in that role.
Yeah, I love what Jane just said. All I would add is there's a long history in film musicals especially, of bringing pop stars in to hope to co-opt their fan base. And of course, Ariana Grande has a very, very large fan base. It's going to get an awful lot of people into seeing the movie. I'm certainly not surprised that since she was able to do the role so well that they gave it to her. And I have nothing to add about Cynthia Erivo. I think Jane's covered that very well.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the wizard's use of magic versus the female's use of magic.
Well, the wizard doesn't do magic. He has no power. And when Elphaba realizes this, it's what brings about the meltdown that has her make her have to leave after defying gravity. The wizard only claims to have power. He's a fraud. There are no male figures who perform magic in Wicked. I think that's actually important. The women have the power, and they not only have the magic power, they have the musical power, because as I explain in my book, it probably in too much length, the powerful people in musical theater are the ones who are singing. And the vast majority of the songs are sung by Glinda and Elphaba or both. Their vocal presence on the original cast recording is about equal, actually. And the wizard sings, but the wizard had just a couple of songs, but the wizard has no magic. Jane may have more to say about this than I do, but I think it's very important. The wizard is a fraud.
Yeah, this is such a good question, right? Because what kind of magic are we talking about? Are we talking about sleight of hand magic? The kind of magic shows, I'm going to pull a rabbit out of a hat, don't look over here, look over here. That's the kind of magic that the wizard does. He represents for me the kind of traveling medicine show kind of magic or magician that we saw in the turn of the 19th to 20th century, not just here in the United States, but elsewhere. The fact that he's a fraud, but also that he's a confidence man, right? So he basically is, if you think it, you can do it. And look what I have done. I think that is, again, one of these, why this wizard now? Hopefully it's quite obvious that that's part of an era globally that we're dealing with in terms of strong men, confidence men, people who talk a good game, people who might be performing more than they're doing, people whose idea of politics is in fact performance, maybe full stop. But for the women, the witchcraft that they're performing in terms of Elphaba and Glinda, and then also Nessa Rose and Madame Horrible, thank you. Thank you. That magic is what I distinguish in my book, at least, a kind of fantasy magic, because we see flying, or at least like an indication that there might be flight, and we see actual transformations occur right in front of us. And while that is compelling and certainly entertaining and the kind of thing that I too enjoy, my deeper interest is in the kind of magic that contemporary practitioners of witchcraft might be interested in creating through ritual, through intention, through spells and things like that. So I do think that there's something very important here to recognize in terms of the different ways that magic is done gender-wise, that I think it is significant that we have a fraud who's doing magic, but who has a whole lot of power, tremendous power, who is male, versus these women who are doing all sorts of really, frankly, much more remarkable magic, but they don't have nearly as much power.
Yeah, and of course, it's the fact. I mean, and of course, Elphaba has this ability, and she doesn't know what it is. She doesn't know how to harness it. It's Madame Morrible who sees it and tries to teach her some. And of course, the whole idea is she's teaching her so she can bring her to the wizard, and all of a sudden, the wizard would have an assistant who really does have magical power. Yes, the fantasy kind of magic we're talking about, but it's a terribly important part of the story.
And as you said, there are like many different ways of looking at magic, looking at witchcraft. What does witchcraft mean to different people in different contexts? And one thing I appreciate in witch fulfillment, you acknowledge that there are still witch hunts going on. There's persecutions of people
That's
accused of
right.
witchcraft, which is something we talk about a lot on this show. And how do you think we have real world examples like that? Wicked, there's a lot of it about othering, about Elphaba's otherness. How do you think those two things do that? Is there a connection?
Yeah, I don't think it's a direct connection, but let me start by saying, first of all, one of the things I really admire about your show is the fact that you are bringing attention to this. I think so few people understand. I've been teaching in witches in popular culture class here at KU for several years, and without fail, the students are absolutely floored to learn that witch hunts still occur. It's a terrifying time because I'm not sure that we're always necessarily going to be looking at that happening so far away. Yes, there's a lot of this happening in India and parts of Africa and in parts of Asia and in parts of the Americas, right? And probably more close by than you might think. And typically speaking, the kind of folks who are targeted for witchcraft are indeed people who are deemed outsiders for all sorts of reasons, including their sexuality, but also sometimes their power or their ability to heal in ways that go against what is the status quo idea or understanding of what healing is, or even potentially what psychologically is supposed to be, the norm. And in that regard, I think we see some very interesting comparisons, not only with Elphaba, but also with Nessa Rose, right? Because she is an individual who uses a wheelchair. And obviously in the musical, it's not as though we get to know her as this really good person. And I think that's good in some ways to have some complexity there, that we don't always want to just paint with broad strokes an idea of, oh, here's a character with a disability. Let's make sure that that's like the hero. I think we want to make sure that we have full humanity in all the cases. But I think in that family line, there's something potentially quite interesting, especially when you think about the potion, right? So the notion of, again, as much as we are to understand that the potion was also a fraud, that it was also a thing that was being sold for reasons that were money driven as opposed to healing driven. But when we think about what kinds of people are targeted for witchcraft in a desire to either kill or otherwise contain, we often look at healers. We often look at people who are using unusual ways to heal others. And if you think about what Elphaba's project becomes in terms of her dedication to the animals, right, and her desire to stop what's happening to the animals in terms of them losing the ability to speak and them losing status, I think in the animal class we see a little bit of a parallel to what we can look at in terms of the long history of witch hunts.
The othering issue is with Elphaba, it's a fascinating part of the show. And she's green. There's all kinds of things that make her different. It's made very clear in the script and in the music that she is an other, and everybody considers her to be so. When her powers become clear, obviously she becomes even more of an other. Nessa Rose is a problem character. She was supposed to have a much larger part. She had a song. The melody every time she sings in the show, she sings the same melody, and that was going to be her own song. But they realized they could not have three major female characters. The musical wasn't long enough. The story, you can only do so much in a musical. It's hard to develop character. And Nessa Rose, she just had to be put on the back burner. It's not what they wanted to do, but it just became absolutely necessary. As far as her disability, the way the disability is treated in the show, it does not show any kind of forward-looking thinking about how disability can be treated in a musical or a film or anything else. It's pathetic, really. But it's all part of this, keeping her character from being too important, because beyond Elphaba and Glinda, they simply could not have another female that the audience was going to be wondering much about.
The song Dancing Through Life suggests very different worldviews between the characters. How does Wicked use these personal conflicts to explore larger political ideas about power and prejudice?
Ooh, what a great question.
Such a good question.
Um, where would you start with that, Jane? I'd go straight to the music, but maybe we
I was hoping you would talk a little bit about the music, and because I used to play violin, but I am just not as, I just don't understand it in the way that you do.
Yeah. The song Dancing Through Life was the last one that came together for the show. And the major reason for that is it bears such a huge plot, that so much of the plot is developed in that song. It's 7 or 8 minutes in length. And we learned so much about Glenda. We learned so much about Alpha, but Fierro comes in and we have this kind of dense male character, but he's the party guy. And we get that established. There's so much going on in that song. They worked it out the show ran in San Francisco in June of 2003. And Schwartz had allowed to have a full out production. He was hoping to have a simple production in New York. But instead, he wanted a full-out production in San Francisco, as far away from New York as they could. But he allowed that to happen with the stipulation that they would shut the production down for 6 weeks so that they could do their rewrites then. That 6-week shutdown cost the producers $1.5 million, keeping everybody on salary. So this was, I'm sure with the producers, this was one major shouting argument. But it's the way he and Winnie Holtzman wanted to work. And it was during that summer that he wrote Dancing Through Life and that they figured out how they could get all the plot through there. They were still trying to figure out what Elphaba's grand crusade was at that point. The goat was that Dr. Dillman wasn't a history. As you know, he's not a history teacher in the book. He's got some formula where he's trying to prove the talking animals. They wrote all kinds of material to go with that, but they just said it was too hard to show on stage. So they backed away from that, made him a history professor. And a lot of these decisions though were made quite late. So Dancing Through Life was a huge collaborative project through the summer of 2003. I think it does comment on the politics of the show, not as much as the character of the wizard, though. The character of the wizard, I think, is if you will, the political center of the show, because this is the leader of this country, and we recognize things about him that we know about leaders that we've experienced in our lives. Dancing Through Life, for me, it's more of showing a difference of the character, really showing the difference between the characters of Glinda, Elphaba, and Fierro, and Nessarose, for that matter. There's so much character development that's going on in that. And yes, they're witches, but they're also young people. And they're just trying to find their way. They're trying to find people they love. They're trying to find out who they are. And for me, what a lot of what that song is about what so many of us go through, like, late high school and during college, just trying to find out who we are. And I think that's a lot of what's going on in that song. The music, it's got disco in it. It's got normal musical theater material. It's got a little bit of everything. And that's what a musical theater composer has to be able to do, draw in any musical style they need to, so it will be immediately understandable to the majority of the audience.
Paul, will you remind me, is this during the big dance, or will you help me remind?
The dance, the song actually, Elphaba gets the black hat from Glinda during the song. Glinda's talking with her friends, and they say, "Oh, you don't hate anybody that much to give that hat to," and she gives her the hat. And that's where Fierro comes in, and Fierro, of course, looks at the pretty blonde and is interested in her first, as everybody expects him to.
Right.
And then he's to say, well, we got to have a party. So we learn about the Oz Does Ballroom, which in the original novels, a seedy place. It's a little different when you get to it in the musical. And then we have Elphaba coming in and doing the dance herself, and Glinda realizing how deep this woman is and how deep she isn't. And when it goes to her, there's so much character development and story development going on in that song. It's hard to think of songs. There are other songs and musicals that do this much. This one's huge.
I'm glad that my sort of memory wasn't too far off there, because it does. I think this song also allows us to look at how the musical, at least, is, again, not necessarily intentionally doing this, but certainly from a fan perspective, can do this, is showing us the power of the patriarchy as well. And even in terms of Glinda's recognition that she's not so deep, because the way it reads, at least to me, is that kind of at least at the beginning, the only reason she wants to learn more about animals and do anything good is that she wants Fiero to look at her and not to look at Elphaba. And that sort of triangulation for me is an important narrative that isn't always centered in musical theater. We certainly always have like boy meets girl stories. That's basically musical theater. And we certainly always have love triangles. Yeah, absolutely. But to have the sort of jealousy and or different choices hinge on socially relevant kinds of activist choices, arguably, that was that was refreshing, and that potentially has a little bit of a different read. It makes, at least from my perspective as a feminist spectator, to signal Jill Dolan's work, is what that does for me is to say, oh, I knew you were superficial, Glinda, but man. And Fiero, I just have to say how grateful I am that he is just so dumb. No, I mean, at least that he's just so underdeveloped, at least in the stage musical piece of the puzzle, because it's refreshing, frankly, to be able to objectify a male on stage and to not feel bad about it, right? I don't mean to, I don't know what I'm saying really, except for I just enjoy that. And typically the actors playing that role are pretty nice to look at. So there's like this moment of, oh, he's pretty, but who cares? Let's get back to the girls.
And yet he does grow as a character as he grows closer to Elphaba.
Which I attribute to Elphaba and not to him.
Yeah, I would see that. I would understand why. I would understand why. And I can't say I'm a female feminist watching the show, but I am a male feminist watching it. And I am very grateful for a show that spends so much time with the women. Again, it's unusual. It really is. And I'm hoping that the film carries a similar message along those lines. I don't see how it can't, but we have seen much ballyhooed musicals come in and just fall flat on their face.
What are you most looking forward to in the film?
Well, the score.
That's right. Aren't there new songs?
No.
Or not new, but like...
No, I don't think so. I think I haven't heard that. Have you?
I have. I've heard, let's put it this way. I've heard it on Reddit. So what does that mean? I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing the songs I love with a full symphony orchestra, which is that's an awful lot of fun in a film, because film studios use full symphony orchestras. You can only fit so many instruments in a pit. So it opens, and even if nobody knows what they're listening to, it opens up the score in a way that it's going to sound completely different than the show. The other thing I'm looking forward to is seeing all the things you can't do on stage, because we can have singers, we can see their faces while they're singing. Everybody needs to remember that film is a completely different medium, and you can't just say we're filming Wicked. You're exploding Wicked when you're bringing it to a screen. So I'm looking for all of those things.
One of the things that I think is really exciting from what I've been reading and even just some of the videos that have started to trickle out, there are at least a couple of scenes that seem somewhat continuous, that they built such a huge set that because it's rare in film to have continuous shots. And there are at least a couple of them that are set in this sort of bigger area with all the actors on set and with three-dimensional sets that have been built at great expense and with a camera that's tracing all of that more or less in one shot, as far as I understand. That is very exciting because, to Paul's point, typically when we jump to film, that's one of the things that we miss. We miss the sort of largesse of the world. Because, of course, with theater, we can always choose who we're going to look at or what we're going to look at on the stage, whereas the camera is giving us the sort of frame that tends to be much more close. But the other thing that I think I'm really looking forward to, again, as a makeup person, as someone who is both a makeup enthusiast and a makeup artist, is I'm really looking forward to seeing how the green skin transfers on film. That's a very difficult color to work with other colors on stage and with lighting. And then everything I've seen of Ariana's costumes and her makeup and her hair, I'm really looking forward to that kind of design element being much more, for lack of a better word, consumable. And then the final thing, as someone who does theater and wants more and more people to be interested in both theater and in witches, I think it's just going to widen the possible audience for both for musical theater and for folks who, if they're not already interested in witches or fantasy witches at least, that it's going to widen that audience base.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. It's been a
Our
real
pleasure.
pleasure.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Professors Laird and Barnette.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of Witch Hunt.
Join us every week.
Have a great today and a wicked tomorrow.